Hello everyone, Divya this side. I hope the audience has been gaining insights from the various sessions we have had so far. Thank you for joining the session. So this session is a bit different from the usual conference lineup. It's a live episode of the Real World Wednesday podcast. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Real World Wednesday podcast is one of the longest running podcasts in the real world evidence space, and with over 100 plus episodes. It's hosted by two of our esteemed guests, Kamauu and Matt Veatch. So Aaron is a physician, entrepreneur, and industry leader in real-world data and evidence. He's the co-founder and CEO of Navidence. He guides real-world data strategies to support clinical research, drug development. With over 2 decades of experience across pharma, biotech, CROs, and startup, he has led initiatives in pharmacology, outcomes, research, protocol optimization, and regulatory submissions. Trained in medicine, bioinformatics, and public health at University of Utah, Dr. Kamauu brings a unique blend of clinical data science expertise to advance evidence-based innovations. Matt Veatch is the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Navidence, as well as serves as a consultant in the healthcare real-world data and RW ecosystem. With over 25 years of experience in RWD and life sciences, Matt has a wealth of experience in shaping new research models and different paradigms. Matt has previously served as a managing director and has held several leadership roles at Syneos Health, Quintiles, etc. Additionally, he is a founding board member of the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, which was launched in December 2020 and has grown remarkably to over 90 life science technology and government partners. So this podcast has been an inspiration for us in shaping the themes of the summit, and Aaron and Matt have been gracious to help us to put together this part of summit. A huge thank you to both of you. And from here, I'll hand it over to Aaron and Matt to introduce our panels, and you can take it forward from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Divya. A real pleasure. Excited to be here. Excited to have such a distinguished panel. It's a pleasure to once again be a part of the RWEsearch and Health Innovation Summit 2025. And it's also a crossover event for us. As you mentioned, we are the co-moderators, Aaron and I, of Real World Wednesday, a weekly podcast about the RWD and RWE arena. And so it's a real pleasure to have this crossover event. And this will also become an episode for us. In fact, episode number 187. So it's exciting to have been at Real World Wednesday for so long and to really foster such great communication and interaction between this delightful community. Before we kick off, and this is one of those things for our podcast, I always have to mention that at the outset, our guest views are their own and not those of any company, agency, or other organization. So they're speaking for themselves, their own opinions. And once again, we're excited to have such a distinguished panel. We will turn to introductions here in just a moment. We've adjusted the title just a little bit. We're going to expand the focus. So we're operating from the perspective of RWD in the wild, a practical guidance for real-world research success, kind of moving beyond sort of validation, really looking at the various components and the aspects of research quality predicated on real-world data access and looking at many of the facets of that, deploying real-world data, accessing real-world data, and of course, the regulatory framework supporting non-interventional research. With that, I will turn to our distinguished panelists. Charlie, I'll kick off with you. Oh, unfortunately, we seem to have a microphone issue once again. With that, while you're adjusting that, why don't we go ahead and turn to you, Stu, for your introduction.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Stuart McCully. I'm a pharmacologist by training, and my expertise is in the regulatory side of things. It's what is it I need to do if I want to run a real-world data or a real-world evidence study, such as a non-interventional study, and then tying together the nuances so that it becomes actionable. So, Charlie?
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Glad to be here. My name is Charlie Barr, and I'm a physician scientist. I worked in healthcare for about 18 years, obviously using real-world data as a clinician at the bedside, but also installing electronic medical records. I also used AI in the early days and went to a startup to use AI and real-world data in improving care, and then finished my career in the life sciences space in pharma companies, in leading clinical trial programs as well as real-world data programs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charlie. And Radek, over to you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. Radek Wasiak. I have been in this space for more than 2 decades, both as a researcher, as we all did at the beginning of our careers, and then as an executive across different organizations, PPD, Evidera, Cytel, you named a few. Currently founded 2 organizations, one focused on deploying more advanced approaches, causal inference approaches, co-founded with Miguel Hernan and Mona Khaled, called Adigens Health. And we'll talk about what these are in this context here, as well as rare data, where we focus on provision of data in rare diseases. So happy to contribute.
Thank you so much, Radek. And once again, Aaron and I, we co-founded Real World Wednesday back in 2021. And it's been such a pleasure to host guests over the years, distinguished luminaries in the field as we have today assembled for our panel. Aaron, I'll turn to you. Any additional opening comments that you'd like to make as we kick off this discussion with the distinguished panelists?
I think really just welcoming everyone, thanking everyone. As Matt mentioned, we've been doing Real World Wednesdays now for a number of years. We super excited and grateful for all the support, participation. Those of you who have been guests on, those of you who join frequently, some of our panelists today being people who have joined us on Real World Wednesdays a number of times, and we appreciate that. And certainly we really are excited about this partnership with Healthark and the RWEsearch Health and Innovation Summit. So we really appreciate being here. It's a unique opportunity for us to do this in video format. So anyways, we'll take advantage of that and enjoy this discussion today. So yeah, Matt, thanks.
Yeah, well, and I'm excited to moderate the panel. Aaron is going to serve the role of panelist, and we'll jump in from time to time with moderation. But Aaron truly is a luminary, an expert in the field, and a key opinion leader. So it's going to be great to get your input and insights and wealth of experience, Aaron, as well. So with that, just to set the stage, we'll focus on, again, real world data in the wild. This is going to be a bit more of a practical guidance. So we have 1 hour, which is our opening comments. We'll go through the background for each of our panelists, about 10 to 15 minutes or so for each of those. And then we'll have an entire hour for Q&A following this. So this is really exciting for us because typically in Real World Wednesday, we're always trying to get a few additional questions in, and it's a 1 hour episode. So today, having more time to really dive in is going to be great. We welcome questions. We would love to have as much audience participation and discussion as possible. Obviously, the chat feature is the way to pose those questions, and we'll quickly get to those towards the end. We'll come back to questions, I should say, after that first hour of commentary by the panel. So kicking off is going to be Charlie, setting the stage for research considerations as one is planning for the use of real-world data for evidentiary use cases. Charlie, what are some of the things that are important to consider? Everyone has to start somewhere. It's been said, the longest journey starts with the first step. What are things that teams that are planning on real-world evidence research, what do they need to consider?
So I've laid out kind of a framework with 3 bullet points to allow us to focus on those 3 areas and dive into them one by one. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was laying a firm foundation for meaningful impact. Second is building the machinery or the engine for developing reliable and credible evidence and knowledge. And third was collaborating to discover and create the future. So in a big picture sort of way, these are layers that stack on top of each other and operate or interoperate collectively in parallel. So the foundation of creating impact, meaningful impact, is really at the level of the high level goals. What is the objective? What is the organization that you're with? Are you a pharma company? Who is the sponsor? Who's the funder? What are the ethical responsibilities and accountabilities? Are you just delivering the answer that they want, or are you? We are embedded in science, so we have a responsibility and accountability to support the better good for the patient as the central stakeholder. We may be one of the stakeholders with our own perspective, but if we are not, improving the individual patient's life or the population's benefits, then we're introducing friction or inefficiencies in the system, and we need to refocus on what is the real objective, so that is our compass and drives where we're going. And then the impact is, beyond the evidence that we generate. How is that going to be used? Who's going to use it? Is this just a publication for our CV, or is there, how can we leverage what we do and position it to build on what's already known and contribute to the continual, building of reliable knowledge? So that's kind of that first theme of the foundation. And then the second theme of the machinery, or engine if you prefer. So that, you could think of that either as focusing on individual studies or on building the infrastructure, the tools, the capabilities. And, too often we're really focused on individual studies one at a time. I really became aware that this was inefficient when I ran the registry group at Genentech, where you're building a whole infrastructure for one study and then you throw it away at the end of the day. So I think everybody is now recognizing that more infrastructure can be reused, and platforms are being built to reuse data. The FDA Sentinel Network, the All of Us study by NIH, the N3C study of COVID back in the day. So reusable infrastructures, and that includes bridging between trials and observational studies or real-world data. So you might remember that early days of the field, one of the definitions of real-world data was data collected outside of a trial. Within a year or so, FDA changed that and said it can include trial data, but it's data about the patient and their journey through the healthcare system and their experience and outcomes of the disease. So, the whole field is changing and growing in our appreciation of what are we trying to accomplish and what are the tools that we have. But the biggest thing probably in that machinery is that there's been a lot of advances over time. And Radek mentioned, the advances in causal inference. So I wanted to mention a few of the advances that have occurred in that area, which is, there's been professional societies and groups that, like ISPOR and ISPE, that have jointly developed guidances over the years, and those have matured. There's, the FDA itself, and then there's Duke Margolis, FDA Sentinel Innovation Center. So a lot of people, a lot of scientists and organizations working to advance the methodology and embed them into software tools, libraries, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. And then those roadmaps are trying to put a sequential framework from all the way from defining the right question to the study design and the reporting and so forth. So there were guidances like STROBE which is a reporting checklist for observational studies. There was work by Sebastian Schneeweiss and his team on replication requires transparency. So you can't replicate a study if they don't publish the methods in enough detail to actually replicate them. The target trial emulation, which I don't know if Radek's going to go into that more, innovation in how you think of and frame your study design based on a target trial so that you can use all the causal inference qualities of a trial and the randomization that attaches to that, and focus on preventing design bias in addition to controlling for confounding. And that's by focusing on the key elements of time zero, the treatment assignment process, avoiding immortal time bias and selection bias. So then finally, the third pillar was collaboration. And that really is, we are now an ecosystem, and you can be a player doing a study, single study, or an organization that does multiple studies, or you can be one of the players that are focusing on building data assets or on connecting and integrating data like Datavant and tokens and other companies of that sort. But each of us have the opportunity to keep abreast of the advances in that ecosystem and then leverage those, test them, implement them in our own arena, but also to contribute to those ongoing advances as a researcher and a scientist. So it's really an exciting time and place to be in the real-world data space, and particularly with the potential for collaboration with trials, whether it's external control arms, recruitment, et cetera, and with the possibility of using AI. So there's lots of exciting frontiers for us to work on discovering what is feasible and useful for us and contributing to building the future together. So that's my overview of the research considerations from a big picture point of view, because I know everybody else is going to go into deeper details.
Yeah, that was perfect, Charlie. And speaking, from a wealth of experience, because you've done all of these things many, many times, and that's so critically important. It's to have that again. This is real world data in the wild, what it takes to really execute on a research program. So that was fantastic, and plenty of opportunity for Q&A coming up soon. But first, Aaron, let's turn to you. As we move away from just sort of the research considerations overall, at some point there is a specific research study in mind. And why don't you take us down the path of some of those protocol design considerations, ensuring the appropriate level of precision in the research. What are key things to keep in mind as someone might be contemplating what to do next?
No, this is great. And again, I want to second your comment about Charlie. Charlie, thanks for that kind of overview of those topics. And Charlie, I'm going to feed on some of what you just said, meaning I remember being in your Genentech office maybe 12 or 13 years ago now, maybe, where we were talking through evidence generation kind of planning and evidence generation needs. And I remember on your whiteboard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie, but I feel like I remember you building out almost like this, looked like a mountain diagram where it was kind of different kind of levels of evidence we can generate and how we needed to be thoughtful about the questions we were asking, but also then take the questions we're asking and align it with those various levels of evidence generation, whether it be on kind of existing medical claims data, maybe it's on more robust real-world data, maybe it's all the way up to, double-blinded randomized clinical trials, but just different methods of generating evidence. I guess first off, Charlie, do I remember that diagram correctly? Because I want to build on that concept a bit.
Very, very good memory. I probably have a shot of that whiteboard in my photos. But yeah, that makes sense, and it ties to the FDA's framework of, first, the data has to be fit for purpose. Second, you have to have analytic methods, design, et cetera, that creates reliable evidence. And third, you have to consider the regulatory requirements. And that's a good framework in general.
And so, for me, and even before that, but certainly since that early conversation, it's reinforced for me how important it is that we're very thoughtful upfront about the research questions we're asking. And they can range, right? And it's not like they're right or wrong. It's just that, are we asking the question to get an answer that we really intend to use? And I think sometimes we can be a little bit off with that. So being really thoughtful upfront about what questions are we asking, for whom, for what purpose, who's the audience, what's the intended outcome we're trying to accomplish after we've already generated our evidence from that research question. It reminds me, for those of you who've gone through medical training, and even those who not, you've probably heard this before, but I remember when I was a medical student, and especially when I was an intern in my residency program, it was very tempting as a young doctor to order every lab I could think of because I had a patient in front of me and I didn't know what I was dealing with. And so I'd be like, oh, how about I order these labs and this imaging? And it was tempting to just order a lot of tests to try and help me figure out what was the medical condition in front of me, especially when we're in the emergency room or admitting a patient into the hospital. And I was, we're trained early on as doctors by more seasoned doctors to say, before you order a test, before I order that lab test or that medical imaging test or so forth, I need to already know what I'm going to do with the answer. If the answer comes back high, low, abnormal, positive, negative, before I even get the answer, I already need to know what I'm going to do with that. And that's always resonated with me because from a clinical research perspective, I think we need to have that same mentality. When I'm asking myself, this is a research question, I should already be ready to know whatever the answer is, here's what I'm going to do with that answer. Here's how I'm going to engage the stakeholders, whether it's the regulators. I know Stu's going to talk more about regulations, whether it's other stakeholders that we're trying to generate evidence for, even if it's for academic purposes or to get publications out there. I think that thoughtfulness about what is the question I'm asking and what's the purpose to ask that question becomes so foundational. And then I think, building on that diagram that I have in my mind, and Charlie, I'm going to need to get a picture of that someday from you, from your photos, is that then that kind of directly drives the use case. Like, well, what are the methods that I'm going to use to answer that question? I know 15 years ago, it was oftentimes very much clinical trial first and then augment with real world data. And I think one of the things that's super exciting about real world data today is that there's a little bit of a shifting in mindset. I've even heard it from the regulatory agencies unofficially, where there's a shifting in mindset to say, well, let's be more data first philosophy. Let's challenge and pressure test whether or not real world data approaches could answer that question appropriately and reliably for what we need it for its purpose. And then let's kind of resort to maybe more costly and time consuming and also probably higher precision. But let's resort to the other kind of evidence generation models like randomized clinical trials when we need to. So certainly I'm not trying to imply those will go away and never exist. But I think this ecosystem we have in front of us, as we have our formulated research question well defined, our purpose as to why we're asking the question, what we're going to do with our answers, and then we start looking at that cascading of methodology as to how might we answer this question, we can think of, well, can existing data fit for purpose? You mentioned exactly that term, Charlie, right? How do we assess data solutions, data sources, analytic and statistical methodology, and how reliably can we answer that question for the purpose we have? And where do we need to kind of move up and down that scale of rigor on the kind of use cases? And for me, one of the key kind of components, and no one will be surprised as I say this, if anyone knows me, even a little, is that one of the key components around that is as we're defining our study design and those study elements based on that research question and based on that use case of using global data, augmenting clinical trials, and so forth. As we do that, how essential it is that we're thoughtful around the selection of operational definitions to drive that those research questions. And again, one of the key things that I want to highlight right here is, so we have our research question thoughtfully defined. We have our purpose now defined. We've selected maybe a use case of using real-world data and a methodology of analysis. Don't limit yourself on operational definitions based on what you think is or is not available. But instead, just like we have to be thoughtful about a research question, be thoughtful about your operational definition as truly what you need for your study. Oncology comes up a lot. I've heard folks from the regulatory agencies talk about how when you think about cancer, we're thinking about real world evidence in cancer and progression of disease being an important aspect of an endpoint of interest. Not oftentimes they're going to expect that we do radiographic and pathology based progression of disease. We might have some other algorithms and definitions that we might use for other kind of real world data sources, like surrogate algorithms and medical claims databases, which do fit a really good purpose. But if I'm going to submit something around castration-resistant prostate cancer, and I'm looking at progression-free survival as an outcome, and I'm going to do that to the regulators, I need to know upfront, I might need to do radiographic-based evidence of progression of disease. Therefore, I need to pick an operational definition that's based on imaging, RECIST scores or modified RECIST scores or something to that nature. And I might already think I can't find that in the data, but it doesn't really matter. That's the definition I need. Select that definition, define my study elements appropriately and reliably. Now I have the recipe ingredients to go and assess data sources as truly fit for purpose. And I might be limited in the data sources, but I actually know I have a more precise definition. So I might need to go partner with the right folks in the right environments around the world to say, I need to go reread images. This is just what I need in order to demonstrate the precision that is required to reliably answer the research questions. So, Matt, I know kind of feeding back a little bit to you as moderator in the session, I think the kind of key themes in my mind are be thoughtful about how you're defining your research question and what the purpose is of asking that question, who's your audience, that directly influences or directly impacts my study design and the use case and the study elements, and then computable operational definitions, or we'll use the term codefs a lot for short, being super thoughtful about the codefs I'm selecting and not limiting it to what I think is or is not available in data, but truly selecting the definitions that are most appropriate to that study design to answer that question. So at the end of the day, when I'm presenting it to the stakeholders, when I'm publishing my papers, I can be very confident and they can be confident in the evidence that I'm generating.
That's fantastic, Aaron. Thanks. And I guess first moderator question, and most of our questions we will save to the second hour, but just to interject, maybe you could share just a little bit more around how one could create that operational definition, how we know the purpose. At a practical level, what are some of the things that are addressed with an operational definition?
And that's a great question. And I'm going to build on the terminology used in the FDA guidances. So FDA guidances talk about conceptual and operational definitions. Conceptual definitions being effectively that a conceptual construct around what it is we're interested in studying. So we might have an inclusion criteria. I mentioned castration-resistant prostate cancer. So we can look through that and say, well, how is castration-resistant prostate cancer conceptually defined? Well, it's a patient who has prostate cancer who underwent some kind of androgen deprivation, either medical or surgical. The deprivation has to be effective. So usually what happens is you'll look for low testosterone levels afterwards to say, hey, that androgen deprivation was effective, and yet despite that, they continue to have progression disease. So you would call that castration resistant, or some people call it hormone resistant prostate cancer. So we have those conceptual, but for each one of those concepts, now we have to decide, how are we going to operationally query real world data for it? I need to find first that idea of prostate cancer. And in some data sources, I might define that as a diagnosis code or a diagnosis for prostate cancer. In fact, that'd be the most common way to look at it. But even there, I might not need to decide how sensitive or specific of an algorithm do I need to wrap around that concept. So is it sufficient to look for just one diagnosis code? And if I see one diagnosis in the records for prostate cancer, am I confident enough that that patient has prostate cancer? Maybe with prostate cancer, I am, because it's a cancer and so forth. But if I'm looking for asthma, or if I'm looking for type 2 diabetes, I might need more than just one diagnosis code. I might need to look at two diagnosis codes, or maybe I'll give more confidence if I see a diagnosis code in a hospital inpatient encounter setting versus maybe I need to see two diagnosis codes in an outpatient setting. And in some cases, I might even want to layer on more precision. I might say, well, in order to know if someone has heart failure, I need to look at diagnoses and medication records. If I see them having both a diagnosis of heart failure and treated with a heart failure med, now I'm more confident they really do have heart failure. So that's what we mean by operational, meaning you heard right there, for one concept, like a medical condition, I could have 3, 4, 5 dozen even different ways that I might query real world data to identify that one clinical concept. And I need to be thoughtful about which one of those algorithms, which one of those computable operational definitions, which code lists I'm using, what medications are in my medication list are actually then core to how I'm defining querying data for that clinical concept. Oh, and you asked how? So one of the main ways we do that is using literature, using guidelines. We can see the kind of studies that have been submitted to our state ADMA and kind of understand what kind of definitions have been acceptable to some of those. I already mentioned the fact that we're confident if you're going to submit stuff to a regulatory agency around cancer progression, you need radiographic or pathological based progression of disease. So we can look at those guidelines. We can look at American Heart Association, American Lung Association, and then we'll apply some medical informatics techniques and methodologies to manage things like code lists and mapping between different code systems, which we can dig into here, but it also gets a little complex. But it's important to be thoughtful about it, because being off by a few codes, having the wrong meds in your list can change the outcome of your results. There's a quote from one of the FDA guidances that says, FDA recognizes that small differences in operational definitions may have a large impact on study results. So again, important to be super thoughtful about this.
That's fantastic, Aaron. One question that comes to mind, and kind of a high level question, but many research teams, they sort of identify a data set that they think they need. It could be an EMR, it could be a claims data set, and then they try to identify patients in that data set. In your view, it sounds like it's much more important to sort of conceptualize having these coding ontologies and define the operational definitions, and then look to the data assets that might support that. Is that a fair characterization?
That is fair. And I think it's because I've seen too often where we've limited the scope of our vision on our study and our operational definitions based on what we think is available in data. And therefore, we end up with less reliable data sources for that specific question. So there's a lot of real data options, especially in the US, in Europe, and across multiple regions of the world, that's becoming more and more available. And you'll hear more about that. Radek in particular, you're doing a lot of work to make that feasible in some of the regions of the world. As that becomes available, we need to be much more thoughtful at selecting the right data source that fits our need, which also means that we're selecting the right definitions up front based on what we actually need, not based on what we perceive is available in data. I think that's a mistake we often have made in the past. I know I've made it in the past and have learned the hard way to be more thoughtful up front. Design my study the way I need it, then go find the right data and partners to get the data I need. Then apply, as Charlie mentioned, the appropriate statistical analyses on top of that data. And you have to string all of that together at the end of the day then to say, here's what we did, here's how I was thoughtful about it. Therefore, my stakeholders can be confident in the evidence I'm generating.
Fantastic. Sort of a little mute button issue there, but no, thanks, Aaron. That's very insightful, and obviously a wealth of questions that we'll pose a little bit later. So let's forward, going down that virtual path for a moment. We've got the protocol design. We've statistical analysis plan on all of those considerations are addressed. A critical consideration, and it's not always top of mind for many researchers, it is the regulatory aspects. And so, Stu, we will shift to you because so often from my experience, the regulatory considerations, the actual deployment is a bit of an afterthought. There's this design and plan, and the team is marching off to execute, and only then do they really start to consider the regulatory framework that's going to be necessary, and that is a misstep. Regulatory needs to be brought forward in the research, and you are an absolute expert in this area, so please take us through some of those considerations in laying that regulatory framework and how that benefits the team.
Thanks, Matt. I will do that indeed. So, let's be honest, there's nothing more exciting than regulations. It's part A. What's really interesting is, most of us that are involved in real world research, think non-interventional studies, observational studies, we are used to clinical trials, and we are very spoiled because generally in a country there is a clinical trials regulation. That's it, full stop. And it follows ICH GCP. It's all very familiar. And then you're part of the project team and someone says, right, you're doing a non-interventional study and it's in 17 different countries. What happens? So your first shock is you don't follow ICH GCP. Your second shock is that every country has its own regulations, and they tend to be built up from things like biomedical research. There might be a little section in your clinical trials regulations, and you've got your data protection, you've got your vulnerable adults. There's a whole mixture of regulations you need to tie together per country just for your multinational study. And this is why when Matt says, think about it up front, this is not a small piece of work. So if you've got one of those teams within your company that does this for you, you should be sending them donuts and coffee because it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And the beauty about this is what this helps you do is it helps you understand, okay, so what type of engagement do I need with regulators if I'm going to use this data to support a marketing authorization, a label extension, or if it's a safety study? What are the approvals that I need? Are there protocol templates that I need to follow? Think post-authorization safety studies in the EU. My informed consent form is going to be different to that in a clinical trial. And a lot of countries have their NIS, informed consent templates, or guidance, or you default to the Declaration of Helsinki. Then you get guidance on substantial amendments, safety reporting, you get information about progress reports or no progress reports, end of study notifications, final study reports, and publications and registration. So don't forget study registration. So all of these things that you take for granted in a clinical trial, you literally have to go step by step in a non-interventional study. So that's why I often talk about, these are regulations, but not as we know them. These aren't the familiar clinical trials. The things that are very constant for non-interventional studies, you're going to need ethics committee approval in the country of interest. And you need to consider, especially nowadays, think EU with GDPR, US with HIPAA. So all of the data protection is a big deal. And if you're taking samples for genetic analysis, or you're actually collecting genetic data, there was probably a separate consent form. So all of this is really helpful for you as a project team to understand what is it I need to do. That's all the regulations tell you, because if you understand what you need to do, you also understand what you don't need to do. Don't throw the kitchen sink at your study. You don't need to. Just understand what you need to do. And then, so that's the whole operationalizing it. So you've operationalized it, and then you've got that comfort, that confidence that what you're doing is you are compliant from a regulatory and an ethical perspective. And the beauty about what we've got at the minute as well, and Charlie's touched on it, and Aaron, and I know Radek will, think about, we are getting to the point now where there is a lot of information out there in claims, EHRs, etc., and it was very difficult to get access to. So I'll take the European perspective, and we're coming to the point with the European health data space where we have research ready, regulated real world data for research purposes. Beautiful, beautiful. But it's within a defined framework, regulatory framework, that you can have confidence accessing. So I think that's enough on the regs.
Stu, that was great. Perfect foundation setting, key considerations, and just getting research teams to realize the tremendous impact that, especially in non-interventional research, the regulations actually help guide and make decisions around where to go.
Yes.
Because and I'm quoting you as an expert, these regulations in non-interventional research, it's a bit of a patchwork quilt. There's much more harmonization in the regulated trials, the phase 2, phase 3 randomized control trials. And so that patchwork quilt of regulations and ethics committee timelines can vary. All of those things are important considerations. And so getting as much information up front and sort of having the protocol in one hand and the research design and deployment, operationalization of the research on the other hand is critically important to frame up front. So I think that's fantastic. The other point that you have made is the wonderful work that's being done in Europe around making real world data assets research ready, available. There's a defined framework about it. And I think that's an important consideration for every research team that's exploring these studies in Europe. It isn't that data is immediately available. There is a process to access that real world data. And those timelines need to be kept in mind as well. And there's been a lot of discussion around the fantastic work being done with Darwin, as it's known in the EU, and being able to work that into your research is fantastic and absolutely the right way to be thinking, but just aware that there are still timelines and considerations that need to go into that. And on one hand, it's kind of a truism to say, yes, you have to be very mindful of the timeline. On the other hand, from a practical experience perspective, we've all seen research teams that have not properly laid out the timeline and that there are surprises.
Yeah.
And the undercurrent of everything that we're saying today is avoid surprises. It's science, and in science, you rarely like surprises. You like to anticipate them. And to Aaron's point, if you have a piece of information that you're looking for, a question, know how you're going to use the response or the answer that you get back. Being able to weave that in is critically important. Excellent. All right, Stu, thank you so much. Well, Radek, so we've, again, walking down that virtual path of research, the research considerations, that foundation is set, the design elements, the protocol, the computable operational definitions are in place, a regulatory strategy and appropriate timeline have been established. And then there's that practical aspect of the other real world data that might be necessary. And you have tremendous experience, as you noted, a couple of decades of experience in the space. And that includes more recent real world data access in the MENA region itself, but more broadly, other regions. And speaking from that experience, maybe you could share with us just some of those key considerations in actually getting the data that's necessary to either enrich a real world data study, could be an RCT, but access to that real world data. There are many aspects of that need to be considered. Take us down that path for just a moment.
Thanks, Matt. I'm happy to do it, and I'll sort of expand it to saying I'd like to focus the discussion on accessing data that are usable, right? And this builds on what Aaron was talking about. Just getting access to information isn't a problem anymore, right? We passed that stage. I think you need to make sure that what you access, and when you spend the time and resources in doing so, that you know that it's going to be valuable to you. So for me, it's moving us away from the question, can we get it? Who holds it, etc. This has been done, right? And there's ways to do it, and I'll talk to it a little bit. But that's the starting point, right? The necessary but not sufficient. the usability is a much bigger issue, right? I think it's how you, at the timing of accessing the information, know that the information is going to be complete, that it's going to be aligned with your clinical definitions that you have, right? It's sort of a chicken and egg. There's some nuances to what Aaron was talking about, and that there's probably a debate about whether you should start with a definition or you should start with operationalization, right? Like it's arguable that you actually need to do both probably around the same time, because otherwise something is going to go off, right? But the most important element of that process for me is transparency, and the fact that access and design have to happen at the same time. The decision on what you're going to use needs to be in parallel with what you're going to be doing, right? And this is what sort of lately I've been focusing on in both understanding how to expand the access of the data across the different geographies. You've mentioned, my focus on accessing data in the MENA region, and I don't want to get into those details because they're very tactical and practical. But it's actually knowing that when you're assessing a data set, you're doing it not with the question of what data do we have, because that's a simple question to answer, right? Complex but simple. But actually, what we're trying to do with it, right? This is going back to Aaron's point, and then what Charlie mentioned as well at the beginning. And for me, there's an alignment that the framework to do it within, and this is not my belief only, the regulators and payers are sort of circling around the same framework, and it's the target trial emulation framework, right? I'm fortunate enough to work with someone who's sort of focused his career on causal inference and converting causal inference thinking into the sort of more practical application, and as part of the target trial emulation, and that's Miguel Hernan. But the framing forces you to be very explicit when you are accessing the data, right? And I'll come back to this in a second, to think about what's the eligibility, what's the treatment assignment, right? What's the endpoints, what's the follow-up, and then seeing if the available data are sufficient, right? Using the terminal, and you need to know what sufficient means by deploying sort of the approaches that Aaron is advocating for, right? That's why I'm saying it's sort of a chicken and egg. You cannot just start with one and then forget about the other. You have to think about both at the same time, which makes it a fascinating area for us to be in, because we need, we have complexity, right, that we have to deal with. How do you solve complexity? From my perspective, structure, right? Even because without the structure, and I argue for one approach, but there's probably a few others. Even the most sophisticated analysis afterwards are going to be resting on shaky ground, right? So that's my sort of opening, right? A little bit here, but if we think then specific to your question, access. I think it may be tricky, right? But it's no longer impossible, right? If you think about, when I started, it was about just going through the steps, the regulatory steps with a few data sources, and then you got access to whatever was there. It tended to be quite structured, and then you just worked with it, right? Right now, what Stuart was mentioning is substantially more important. Why? Because we have access to detailed information that is being mined, sometimes live, and there are practical regulatory considerations, privacy considerations when you are working with this information. So you need to upfront know what you're going to be dealing with, what you need, right? Which again goes back to having a framework for deciding what you're going to need and what you're going to answer, the questions you want to answer, so that you can decide, do you need direct access to information? You, as the people that are doing the analysis or study, or will federated access be sufficient, right? And then you have to think about the technology to use it, right? And again, it goes back to what's the purpose, right? What question you're trying to answer and how you emulate that question, right? The causal question in real world data. And then you determine to only access what you need, because that reduces the risk, the regulatory risk that we were talking about here, right? So at the point of data access, you have to have all these questions answered, right? And this makes it a fascinating process and difficult process, right? So in my opinion, I'm a simple person. There's two limiting factors. It's time and money, unfortunately, right? It's as simple as that. If you have all the time in the world, right, if you have all the money in the world, you will be able to generate the best data set possible in the proper way. You always have to do it properly, but you will limit the number of restrictions that you have, right? But you don't have it. And so you have to sort of find a way through it by either adjusting your research question or adjusting your operationalization, right? Either are feasible. And that gets you to the position where you can, through the use of frameworks like a target trial emulation framework, for instance, is you can get to some causal conclusions eventually, right? So the data access is no longer, in my opinion, a problem. Technologies exist, right? I don't want to get into specifics of how you access data in federated way, how you protect, you maintain the firewall, how you deploy FHIR and all these sort of technologies, how you process the information to then get you the right results. That's all relatively straightforward. And because of the deployment across the world now, highly advanced electronic medical record systems, you can find patients as long as they exist, right, across the world. It just is an issue of time and money. And I mean, to Stuart's point, European health data space, I'm waiting for this to actually happen, right? But 10 years, it's going to be 10 years before any of us can actually get hands on it, because it's good. Now the good thing is it's going to happen, but it's going to be 10 years, right? So let's be frank about that. So then we're going back, and these are a few points that I will just close with. Access, right, doesn't mean readiness, right? Many data sets are accessible. You can generate your own data, etc. But we know that it's messy. We know that it's inconsistent, and that's why we need the tools as we're discussed here already to do it. Either frameworks, either operationalization definitions, etc. Right? I think the more important thing is when you access the information, no matter where you're accessing it from, is you have to ensure that you pass the credibility test, right? So ask yourself the question, okay, so if you go to a region or etc. and you access a certain data source, what's the purpose of what you're trying to do? And whether you will have the necessary credibility with the data to be able to, for anyone who's looking at the output from your analysis, will they trust what you did, right? And that's the reason why, again, we have guidance from FDA, especially explicit guidance. NICE in UK have put out guidance on how to work with real world evidence, and this is where there is alignment on this target trial approach to ensure that if you're trying to draw some conclusions that are causal in nature, that you define the hypothetical trial first, right? This test, sort of, what's your causal question? And then you explicitly go through the process of ensuring that the data are sufficient. And if the data are not sufficient, you go back. You have to adjust your question, because otherwise you're just introducing bias, right? There's no amount of operationalization of the data if you know that the bias is going to just impact your findings, right? There's practical issues, right? Will you have enough patients, right? Will you have enough information that to meet the specific needs of your research question in rare diseases, right? an area where I focused on. Will the data be granular enough for you to adjust for different genetic variants, etc. Right? So there's a lot to do there, right? Will the data meet the regulatory expectations, right? This is also what you need to answer at the time of data access. That's the question you need to answer at that point as well. So regulators don't expect perfection, but they expect transparency, right? You have to go through the process of showing them what you've done, right? Data provenance is super important, right? They need to know that you didn't just pick what you like. You need to show them that how you've accessed it, that there's a trail of accessing this information. And again, target trial framework provides that clarity. And frankly, this is nothing new. Good epidemiologists have been using this approach for years, right? We're just now realizing in the data world that is super messy, we need that structure, right? And this needs to guide our data access processes. So for me, sort of the current state, I second what was being talked about, which is there's a lot of reliance on a bit of opportunistic reuse of the data without thought to date, but we're moving from there, right? Just a paper in JAMA came out on sort of the guidance of how to do how to deploy the target trial framework in a proper way. I think we're going to see the shift to deliberate design and access. I think we're going to be always starting with a question: do we have enough time to generate the data that are fit for purpose? And then we're going to be saying, if not, how can we do it otherwise? And access to the data, federated, direct way, is not going to be a problem, right? And then the question is going to become, can we actually get to having platforms like what Charlie was advocating for, that are going to be, that will enable multiple parties to answer this, to access the same data in a way to generate comparative findings across the studies. That's my dream. But I like to dream. I don't know whether this is going to be a practical solution ever, given the field in which we're operating. But I think it's a good sort of guiding post to go towards, even if it is within each company, right? Within each sponsor that does these studies, that they do it in that way, right? So that we are not wasting effort at regenerating and recreating information. I hope this was useful. I just wanted to finish here, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Indeed. No, Radek, very, very helpful, insightful for sure. And, anyone that's been in the RWD space for a while has seen, on one hand, incremental changes over the last few years, but on the other, maybe not revolutionary, but certainly substantial changes. Just thinking back in my own experience over the last few years, outreaching to individual health systems around data access was, again, not that many years ago, met with a lot of scrutiny and concern around patient privacy, and here in the United States, HIPAA considerations. And I'm seeing the not softening of the position on privacy, it's critically important, but just the way that data can be accessed in a risk mitigated manner, and how that data can be leveraged to support research. I think in many cases gone are the sort of the legacy committees that were often involved in whether data could even be accessed or not. Now there's more systemized ways of doing these things. And of course, that is in contrast to the large systematic organization like Darwin, as we talked about in the EU, albeit it's going to be time before it's accessible as it's been envisioned. But the fact that it's happening, that it's taking place, I think that's what's so exciting, and where the passion that comes through in all of our voices, where that comes from is seeing these changes, knowing the power of data, knowing the power of good questions, and being able to address them in a data-driven manner that sets the stage for research of the future. And I couldn't be more excited about it personally. I know we all feel the same. And as we conclude the first hour of discussion, which is really the position of the panelists, we'll open to some questions. I am so pleased that we've already got some questions that we'll turn to. With that, before we turn to audience questions, are there any panel additional points or additional comments that anyone would like to make before we turn to the audience questions? Charlie, please go ahead.
Yes, everybody, really great discussions, and just exploded the number of questions in my mind. But I wanted to at least question or propose to Radek that, you mentioned the two limiting factors of time and money. So I would agree with that those are kind of the ultimate constraints. I was thinking of proposing, expertise as another limiting constraint, but throw into the bucket that depending on the level of expertise, you can reduce the amount of time and money spent. So you're not figuring things out. You already know how to do things. You've got the experience, you've got the connections to regulators and so forth. But then all the other things that you and myself and others have mentioned, if you have a framework, you have a defined process that is validated and agreed upon, then you're not having to reinvent so much along the way. And then if you have a platform that is reusable by many people and everybody has experience using that platform, so you're not having to learn a new data set, for each study. And I'll just throw out one example where one of the reasons I left Genentech was that I was going to join the AMCP, or the Academy for Managed Care Pharmacy, that was proposing to use the FDA Sentinel Network for a new purpose. And we formed a consortium of 15 pharma companies who you'd normally think of as tight competitors, because it was going to study biologics and biosimilars. So you have both the originator reference biologic and the new biosimilars that are coming on the marketplace. And you're going to be doing prospective comparative efficacy, comparative safety studies using a common data source. And it was to meet, to protect the public safety. Are there questions about the safety of these new biosimilars coming in the marketplace, and then do comparative efficacy and safety? And you couldn't do them separately as individual companies. So you really needed a research consortium to come together to agree on the protocols. Otherwise, you'd have dueling companies trying to position we're better than you guys because we, in this particular study, and then you'd quibble on the study design of the data source, and it would be a mess. So I guess 2 points there. One is the expertise, and all these tools and frameworks can make the cost and time better. And the future is we continue to build out platforms and collaboration. That's another frontier to decrease time and costs.
I would agree. I think there is on the expertise, I'm not going to comment on this, but all I would say is expertise in real-world evidence research, which was, as some of my colleagues have said, a fantastic rebranding of observational research. Right? It's just all of a sudden it got a very nice name, and even though the work has been done for years, decades before, but I've observed substantial increase in the know-how. Right, in the past it was no one really knew how to access the data, which data sources that were credible, which not. We're talking about a very different level of sophistication, and the clinical trial field also moved. Right, so it's not like we're doing the same things on the clinical trial side, which is where the comparison is always being done, against, the way you run clinical trials right now is very different. And if you are to say this information that as part of real world evidence that you'll be generating is supportive of the clinical trial evidence, which is probably the right argumentation, then we have to raise our game as well, right? And that's why I'm calling for the transparency of it, which isn't new. It's simple ask, right? Let's do it in the same way. And then we can compare. Then we can deploy it through platforms. Then we know what's credible, what's not, right? And we all know about some of the research during COVID times with real world data that was highly dismissive, right? Or dismissed eventually, right? So that's one point. The second point, very briefly, to what Matt was saying, what people are willing to do, or on the privacy side, is changing. I think the biggest change that I've seen is the willingness of patients to say yes to their data being linked. Right, it has a lot of considerations. Right, probably Stuart can comment on this, on the privacy regulations, etc. But people see, especially in rare diseases, the value of connecting different data elements, and because of the unmet need that still exists, right, they are saying yes more frequently to creating very, very rich data sets, including their daily measurements, or from wearables, etc., connected to EMR data, connected to claims data, etc. This is just opening up a whole new world of opportunities for us.
Yeah, I just want to double down on one of the comments you made, and you just reiterated that, Radek, is the transparency part of it. And also, I'm going to flow into a question to you, Stu, so I'm giving you a heads up already. But Radek, no, I totally agree, because I've been in a number of meetings with research teams, particularly on the pharma life sciences side, where they start to get stuck in these concerns. Well, what is the FDA going to accept? What are they going to accept? What are they going to accept? And I often have to remind them what they want from us is a decision with our justification.
Mhm.
Like a lot of these things, they may not have actually really thought through themselves yet. So they're expecting us to come to them and say, look, I know this is a question. We know that there may be some limitations and some concerns here. Here's our decision, and here's why we're justifying our decision. And then just lay it out. So rather than iterate and cycle for forever on trying to guess what they're going to accept, we got to go in and say, here's the plan. Here's the plan. Here's our thoughts. Here's why. There has to be the answer to the why. Here's the work we've done to be thoughtful about that. And so, Stu, as I kind of think through some of the comments you were making earlier, and in particular, we're talking to a very global audience today. How different or similar is it, and not to get into details, but more just kind of engaging regulators across the world? Like when we come in with that kind of philosophy of engaging regulators, I don't know, do you see a lot of variability in how we engage regulators across the world, or do you see they're all kind of in the same boat, asking us to justify and and give kind of transparency around our decision making?
I think it comes down to we often talk about regulatory grade real world evidence, yeah. But what I see from a regulator and a regulation perspective is evidence that is acceptable to a regulator. You can justify that because you've got the regulations and regulatory guidance. I'm thinking China, I'm thinking Japan, I'm thinking Saudi Arabia, I'm thinking UAE, I'm thinking France with the health authorities. As Radek was saying, so NICE in the UK, we also have MHA have put out guidance on if you're going to, use real world data to generate real world evidence to support clinical trials or any of this kind of stuff. This is what we expect. So they're not expecting it to be clinical trial data. They're not expecting the randomization. Otherwise, it's not real world data. And this is where we're slightly different with the US that says, clinical trial data is okay. The rest of the world at this point is still clinical trial data is not real world data. So there's a slight difference there, but it's all about, can you show us that that your clinical trial data is generalizable to the population that will be exposed to this drug or med tech. It's as simple as that. And how credible is that data? So it goes back to the transparency and the rigor and all of this kind of thing. So from a global perspective, we didn't see much kind of consensus, I would say, about 10 years ago. Within the last 5 years, it's starting to come together. We're all starting to talk the same language. And on that point, and I'm just going to throw it out there because we talk about Darwin EU. One of the things I always like to emphasize about Darwin EU is this is a pathfinder that is funded and supported by the European Medicines Agency. All about federated data. They are running their own studies. So when they publish their results of the studies that they have run, if you are a manufacturer or a CRO that is interested in running these kind of studies, have a look at what they're doing, what their lessons learned are, and what they're suggesting, because they're running these studies. So you've got the first hand. This is what we did. This is and generally what they're saying is, a lot of the databases and the data out there is primary data. It's not hospitals. It's not secondary data. So they're trying to encourage people to have more expansive data sets. So I've delved into an area I don't know, so I'll stop now.
But if I may, to sort of piggyback on this discussion, right, on what is regulatory grade, I think there's two sort of questions to answer here. The first one, from the technical standpoint, will you meet the criteria? This is where we're talking about data provenance, audit trails, and all of this sort of stuff that is absolutely necessary to prove that you didn't cherry pick, right? So and that you have the ability to make sure that the necessary ethics approvals were there, etc. If you're reusing the information. This is not straightforward sometimes, right? People are not that good at documenting stuff sometimes, right? Let's just be frank about that, okay? And but then it becomes an exercise specific to your problem, not necessarily to there's no generalization that that this data set is going to be regulatory grade for every single problem that we're going to be trying to answer, right, or solve. It's not, right? You then do that sort of triangulation, right? You then go through in a transparent way, showing, right, this is my research question. This is hypothetically how I want to have it answered. Here's how I would do it in the context of the data I have access to, right? How do I operationalize this problem, right? Given my underlying assumption from at the beginning, and if you answer that positively and you bring in the data to the regulator, as Aaron was suggesting, the regulator will say, "Yeah, go ahead, do it," and then we'll see the results. You do the feasibility necessary, and you then do the tough part of actually running the necessary analysis. And you show that you've done it and you've adjusted for all of the biases and all this sort of stuff. That's the analytical component, right? And I think I saw there are some questions about how to deal with missingness of the data, etc. Complex, but that's not a problem, right? The problem we have is the credibility problem, right? That we're trying to actively solve for, that relates to some extent to Charlie's point, expertise. If you don't know, you're just going to question, right? Even though you're not questioning the right things, right? So that's really where I would try to solve that expertise. Give people some tools that they can assess without being an expert. Can I believe in it?
Great insights from everyone. This has been fantastic, and Radek, thank you for taking us through that. I love your practical considerations. Aaron, the same. Charlie, deep thinking in the space, and again, more practical considerations. Stu, I've noticed that we've got some great questions from the audience, which we'll dive into next. We've, in most cases, I would say, at least spoken to some parts of the question, but I'll go ahead and read each of the questions, and we can add additional thoughts, comments. The first of those And going back a little bit earlier in the comment thread, what are the most common misconceptions researchers have had when first approaching real-world data studies? Who would like to tackle that first? Common misconceptions that researchers have had in approaching real-world data studies.
It's going to be easy.
It's going to be, yeah, exactly.
Radek, actually, I was thinking the same thing, and I was thinking, it's the extremes. So I see both misconceptions on one side, that it's going to be easy, that we can answer anything with data. But I also see misconceptions on the other side, that no, data is never good enough and it can't be the solution. So I feel like both sides are extremes causing misconceptions around the use of real data.
Yeah, I think that's a very important one. And I kind of laughingly remember engaging with a client who said, well, we don't think it's really going to be that hard. After all, it's only a real world data project. And we had I had quite a bit of direct laughter and explained why there was much more complexity than what they were considering. But
Matt, can I throw some stuff out there? So
yeah, please.
It's interesting, the questions we get. So, and this even comes from auditors sometimes. So let's go back to what Radek's talking about here. We're talking about observational studies. We can big it up as much as we want, but we're talking about non-interventional studies, observational studies. The questions I have had routinely, even in the last couple of years, are these regulated? They're not clinical trials, therefore they're not regulated. We don't need informed consent because the data already exists. And what we're doing, because they're not regulated, is we're just going to run these to GCP. So, all of a sudden you've got something that is complicated enough from a technical perspective. And you've got complex regulations per country, and then you've added an extra level. And I see it all the time in protocols, NIS protocols, and you'll be able to see them on clinicaltrials.gov and the new HMA, EMA, RWD study catalogue. It was always easier when we called it the EU PASS register. It was a lot shorter. But you'll see in their protection of human subjects section, it will be compliance with this ISPI GPP, the Declaration of Helsinki, and 50% of those protocols will probably say and ICH GCP. And as a regulatory person, I would say to you, what aspects are you going to comply with? Because there's no IMP, there's no investigator's brochure, there's none of this. And if you're saying you comply with it, how do you demonstrate you comply with it when it doesn't exist?
I would say, just as a corollary misconception, is a sponsor that has a regulatory team that's been very rooted in randomized controlled trials and saying they can address all of these regulatory considerations, because what happens, and Stu, I know you're an expert in dealing with this, the regulatory team can also default on overdoing it, on being too rigorous, too focused on addressing RCT-like regulatory considerations, and that adds unnecessary time and cost.
I have seen the term, and it's something that gives me nightmares, and I sleep this night. GCP light. What does that mean?
No one knows, but I think that that we're in the stage where work that was done by epidemiologists during the COVID pandemic have raised the understanding, right, of the need for a different approach to evidence generation, in addition to RCT, increase sort of notoriety of epidemiologists within our world, right? And that allows us to be a little bit more bullish, right, and say no, right? Certain, this is not an RCT. We need a different set of constructs, frameworks, etc., to operate, so that transparency, right, can be provided, and people are not thinking naively what can be done, and or not overestimating what can.
Yeah, no, really good points, and I'd like to give a couple examples of the over regulation or the misperception. So there is, the easy way. Well, let's just comply with everything for clinical trials, which it isn't that easy and inappropriate and costly and et cetera. So that was something that I faced with trying to run a registry group, which was, run like a clinical trial. There was all the legacy clinical operations and statistics and other folks that were, the goal was to make it as high of level of evidence as possible so that it could be submitted concurrently with a clinical trial as real world evidence. So you always had the catch-22 that you've got the trial, but then there's open questions that need to be addressed, underrepresented, et cetera, and representativeness. So then you would have this high level real world data, but then that maybe makes the cost 10 times as much, literally. And yet it's still real world data, so it's not good enough. So I would often refer to the prejudice of evidence as, trying to say that real world data isn't good enough. Well, it's good enough for certain purposes, but what are those criteria? And so, it's really, I like Radek's framework that there's technical criteria, and then there's specific to the disease, the question, the purpose. Those are all, it takes this individual case to drill through those particular questions. And one example of that was we did a study one time in claims data where we were trying to show that Tamiflu might have other benefits beyond the reduction in symptoms, by a day, essentially by 1 to 2 days, which wasn't very big. And so we were looking at claims data to see if we could pick up any reduction in hospitalizations and reductions in complications, et cetera. And we did, but that would never be appropriate for a new indication. It was kind of like an exploratory signal that would need to be validated or replicated to even make sure that it was real, not a chance finding. So it's all in the individual specific use case for some of those questions.
I think this has been great, and it was a wonderful question. Revisiting some common misconceptions and the key considerations. I'd like to move on to the next question, and actually, what I'd like to do, in the interest of time, because we have had quite a few questions, is weave two questions together, noting that Radek has already talked a little bit about what regulatory grade data entails and what that means. The next question is, how do you define high quality real world data in the context of evidence generation? And I'd like to weave into that another question that was posed: how do you evaluate the reliability of different data sources? And I see those quite interlinked, because there's high quality, and the evaluation of reliability is obviously an extension of that. And how do you assess reliability of those data sources? So with that, let's tee up the question just around high quality real world data. How do you define that? How do you evaluate the data in the context of the data source? Aaron?
I can jump in with a little bit around that. I know Radek already laid a little more than a little foundation around the terms of reliability, relevance, provenance, and so forth. When you look at the FDA guidances in particular, and you can correct me, I'm more familiar with those. I know there are a number of guidances with a lot of detail around this from the FDA in particular. They do define, data quality is a hard thing to define, even not just in a regulatory environment, just I would say across all of healthcare. I'm actually at another big EHR company summit right now, and I think even here there's a debate as to what is quality, right? But the FDA kind of took that approach, as Radek was outlining, and saying there's relevance and there's reliability. And, I might oversimplify this a little bit, but the way I think of it is relevance. Are the data relevant to answering my questions? So coming all the way back to what are my research questions? What is the purpose that I'm asking this question for? And therefore, am I actually targeting and looking for the right data to answer that question? But then, and I think that's a little bit more straightforward. I think the reliability is where we spend more of our time. And the FDA splits those out into two things around data accrual and then the kind of what they call quality control, or it's really the provenance and traceability part that Radek was describing. And the way I usually simplify that is, does the data mean what I think it means? I think definitions become a key part of that. When I define, I mentioned an example earlier, like if I see a patient who has a single diagnosis code for type 2 diabetes over the last 5 years, is it appropriate and reliable for me to assume that that patient actually has type 2 diabetes? Or do I need a better set of definitions around a broader set of data maybe to actually be reliable around when I create that cohort, when I look at that outcome measure, when I look at that baseline characteristic, does it mean what I really think it means? Or am I jumping and making leaps from what I see in the data to what I actually am claiming it says? And we need to be really reliable on multiple aspects of that, from the data point and data variable at the data source itself, to the context around where that data came from, to the definition I layer around my queries on that data, et cetera. And then the other part I know Radek already described as well, which is really from, and I agree with you, Radek, it is not always, in fact, often not well documented of where did the data originate from and what happened to those data by the time it gets to a point where I'm analyzing it, that provenance and traceability piece. And it is clearly not as straightforward as we'd like it to be, because oftentimes we're looking at some curated data set for us, and we may not always really know where did that data come from, what was the context, who transformed what translations happened in the middle of that I need to be aware of when I'm now trying to interpret, does the data actually mean what I think it means? So when I think about the FDA's guidances and what is reliability and what is data quality, I like to kind of come back to that. Is it relevant to answer the questions I'm asking for? And does it mean what I think it means when I'm now making claims on the analysis I did on that data?
Could I address just at a very top level the reliability of different data sources like they ask here in this question? So just at the highest level, claims data has the advantage that generally speaking, you have populations, you have enrolled populations, so you have a denominator and you know whether or not they actually visited the healthcare system. And that's across institutions, whereas electronic health records, for example, may have much more rich and detailed information, labs, x-rays, et cetera, pathology, and you can even get to not just the report, but to the actual images. But generally, you don't have a population, so you may not know the 360-degree coverage. Was this patient a referral? What was the care delivered elsewhere? Did they follow up somewhere else, et cetera? So you have kind of contrasting differences there. Registries typically have predefined data elements, so that it's not a reuse of data like for claims or EHR, which were either for billing or for patient care. The registry might be defined for research purposes or for quality improvement, but you have defined data elements, new data elements that are collected specifically for that purpose. But then that's a lot of effort. It's kind of like a clinical trial. You collect data specifically for your purpose, and is that too costly for other purposes, and does it miss things that you need? Then the digital health, just one example of a trial was being run for Parkinson's disease, and they were using wearables to track movement and activity. And the number of data elements from the device far exceeded all of the total other data sources in the trial. And then you had to go through what are the endpoints, how do we derive the features, and how do we analyze that? So that was a huge task in itself. So again, it depends on what kind of digital health data you have and for what purpose. You really have to think through the whole, aligning, as Aaron mentioned so carefully, aligning what you think the data means and how are you going to use it and interpret it. So there's reliability of these sources depends on your purpose and your need.
Yeah, a quick point. Sorry. Yeah, a quick point on what you were just saying earlier about the data the digital health data. I was talking with an anesthesiologist some time back, and as people may know, anesthesiology, they have a lot of monitors going on while patients are in surgery, and they can monitor a lot of vital signs to very low or very small time intervals, right? And yet the question but like, what does that always mean? If I see a change in heart rate in a 1 second time period or a 2 second time period, what does that really mean? Or 3 seconds or 5 seconds or 1 minute, right? So even as we've gotten like many of these devices have now at home, and we really can monitor things like heart rates and almost like EKGs on our bodies in real time, if we are collecting some of that data, we have those same questions today. Well, if I see a change in a parameter from one of these home devices, between a particular time period, like, well, what does that actually really mean anyways? And, what time periods matter or not? So just kind of doubling down on an example that I think you were alluding to there, Charlie.
Yeah, I go to the doctor's office, once a year, get a weight. I recently bought an electronic scale that transfers to my watch every day or to my phone. Not only weight, but body fat, muscle weight, etc. So every day, that's, what do I need with every day? And I joined the gym. They weigh me every month and do all the body fat composition stuff. That's probably enough because I'm not going to be losing much weight in a day, but in a month it might be more reasonable.
Tracking the data. I have a more empirical model. I just know that I'm getting fatter and that I need to do something about it.
Well, so speaking of purpose, right, of measurement, right, as you look at these examples here, it is going to be who's looking at it, from whose perspective, not only the purpose, but from whose perspective. I think it would be safe to say, if you show up in front of FDA or EMA with claims data as the foundation of the analysis that you've done to evaluate safety and effectiveness, you will be laughed at, right? So I'm just saying there's some things you can rule out up front, right? So that you don't focus. Then you can go on that and waste time on that type of endeavor. Connecting this information, if you believe that, for instance, the underlying population is important for you to draw some conclusions, to get that denominator, connecting it to EHR could be the stepping stone of leveraging more information, right? Could be, right? But then we're getting into this never-ending debate, right? Do I need to generate information prospectively because I know that I did it for purpose, and then I can actually try to potentially mirror something that was done in the randomized experimental fashion, right? It then becomes that issue of time and money, right? If for instance, you rely on some PRO claims being something that you would want to investigate, leveraging a retrospective data source is going to be very tricky, right? For a variety of reasons, right? That's PROs are not routinely collected, especially not the ones that are used in clinical trials. So then you would have to do a lot of the design upfront work, thinking which proxies we can use, etc. Goes back to transparency, going back to the issue that I was advocating for. It's not first data source or first design and then the other thing. Together, you have to do it together. You have to think design, operationalization, access, all of it together. And that's the forgotten part. right? That's the forgotten part, that you cannot just wait and magically think that things will happen. And I don't believe that people are doing it, but they're sort of trying to push it as far as possible, until the last moment as possible. And that last moment comes very fast enough when the IND happens, right? Clock starts ticking, and then everyone is running, right? Because time is money, right? Time is money. I want my drug being sold. Then it's a disaster, right? Happening when things are sort of falling a little bit apart, and we're trying to cut corners, right? So I think my point really being is just think of the stakeholder in mind, and then very quickly get to the point of here's the art of possible.
Absolutely. Stu?
One of the things that I've learned about our world, real-world evidence, observational studies, is it is true science. It's all about going back to first principles. It's understanding, the baseline that you can't go below. There is a lot of FDA guidance about, data quality, relevance, reliance. The EMA has come out with their data quality framework. It's a lot of words, and a bloke like me that has to interpret all that and then do newsletters. This is tough stuff. But Aaron, I love your analogy there, because think about it this way: what is relevant? Is it meaningful? So you're the anaesthetist. If you're being presented with information that doesn't help you understand whether your patient is under and still alive, what's the point? That's your relevance. Your reliability is, do I trust it? Simple points. Do I trust that from the perspective of the patient that is on the table? And I think we miss that kind of first principle, the basics of what is it, because we get into the technicalities without first understanding the basics of meaningful and trustworthy, because there's so many words that we have and this is my world, so many words we have in the regulations and guidelines that obfuscate, shall we say, that just hide the basic meaning to this. And Radek, your use case is spot on, exactly. And I anyone that is in observational research, regardless of what field you're in, just go back to first principles. Keep going back down to the point where there's nothing below it. And that's, so again, I'm going to throw it out there because this is what I'm passionate about. Define, work out what kind of study it is you're running. What is it you're doing? Is it a clinical trial or not? And if not, what is it you need to do? All right, I'll stop. Sorry.
Well, it sounds so fundamental, or one might even say basic, but if it was, then we wouldn't have the interactions that we do with various clients and sponsors, coming back to what they're really trying to accomplish with the research. So I think that's absolutely spot on.
So to that point, in the example of Stuart gave, that you wouldn't go to claims data for safety, and yet the FDA uses Sentinel Network, which is largely claims data, but you have to put that in the context of when and why they use it. So typically they use it if there is a unbalance in a trial treatment arm and an apparent signal. So then you look to see what's the benchmark in real world data, what's the incidence of that thing, if you can define it, if it's definable and retrievable within the claims data. Another example, and this is kind of gets to both a triangulation and a replicability or reproducibility kind of framework, where I'll just define triangulation for today's purpose at the moment, that if you have different kinds of data, like you have an imbalance in a trial data, and then you look at claims data, then you can see if the same signal shows up elsewhere, then it might be more believable. So you get different sources, and you might compare, CT data versus MRI data, something like that, kind of getting towards the multimodal kinds of data. So some sources data will pick things up and others won't. And then the replication or reproducibility, if you find the same thing in multiple different claims databases, then you'd say it's more reliable. But if it's hit and miss, then you're not sure if it's a biologic thing or something related to the practice patterns or policies that govern those institutions that are in your claims data set. Just one final example is I was at a Society of Clinical Trials a few years ago, back like in the 2010 to 12 when comparative effectiveness research or CER was hot. And they held a whole day symposium or workshop ahead of the conference on CER. And the morning they talked about the methods and why, trials are comparative effectiveness research. Why is this new thing of CER arising? And then in the afternoon, they had actual case studies, including the table that I was assigned to, where somebody from NIH was proposing one of their trials they were going to fund. And it was a comparative trial of antipsychotics versus non-drug therapy. And for 10 minutes, we were like debating, who do we recruit from? Do we recruit from the ER, the psychiatrist's office, or mental health facilities or public health community facilities? And I said, well, we don't know enough to design this trial, because if we recruit from the wrong sources, what does it mean? And we need a real data study first so we can see the flow of patients, what is the practice pattern, referrals, and so that we could design it with the right question and understanding that would be meaningful to the sponsors for what actions or policies they want to put into place. So that's just another illustration of it all depends on so many things that you have to consider in that upfront design.
Fantastic.
Yeah. If I could add to that, Matt, and then also I'm seeing a question in the chat that kind of aligns with this. Charlie, as I was hearing you think, at the end of the day, we all are kind of circling back around these same underlying fundamentals of the purpose of your research question, your research question, the purpose, the intent that you're going to use it for, et cetera, are really driving all of, the context, even as you mentioned, even if you do look for these signals and these baseline understandings of patient populations in multiple claims databases, having context as to where each of those data come from guides to our ability to really say, do they all mean the same thing? And are they all showing me the same signal or not, right? So I think those are really good examples. And I was going to say, when we're talking about the regulators in particular, there's a question towards the end here around what lessons have you learned about engaging regulators early in the operationalization process. There we go. And so just highlighting that and saying, yeah, that's one of the first things I recommend to research teams who are thinking about using multiple approaches, whether it's augmenting a clinical trial or submitting real-world evidence in any way to regulators, is engage early. Come in there, and as Radek was talking earlier, come in early and say, here's the approach. Here's what we're intending to do. Here's how we're going to use real-world data. Here's our definitions. Here's our purpose. Here's why we're doing it. It's one thing to come in and say, well, it's cheaper or faster, but most often we have more reasons than just cost and time. Incorporating real-world data into our study and evidence generation is really meaningful. Charlie touched on some of those points around getting a broader perspective on larger patient populations across different health systems. Come in and say, we're approaching it this way. We're going to use real-world data this way. This is why we're doing it. This is how thoughtful we've been about the known limitations that we're going to encounter, and here's how we're going to handle them. But engage them early. We're working with the team right now who's working with the FDA. Before they even write the protocol, they're coming in with a synopsis approach and thinking through all of these things and already assessing data as fit for purpose to come in and say, this is why we think it'll work. We've already assessed some data sources and we are confident it will work. Then they're going to start working on the protocol. And then they're going to go back and say, now that we have the protocol, this is continued thought process. And my personal experience has been with the FDA and EMAs, and they have been very open and willing to have those conversations, more so than I even originally expected.
And Aaron, I would say, so Radek, I'll let you jump in here because I'm going to say that, as Radek said, what we didn't used to do is feasibility studies or pilot studies, and Radek this up, and these are really important now because it's demonstrating you've done your homework at the early stage. So Radek, I'll leave you to it.
Oh, no, thank you. And actually, I was there's two dimensions to my answer, right? The feasibility, let's just call this, you do the feasibility to make sure that what you're going to do is going to be fit for purpose, right? You're not doing feasibility to prove the end game, right? The end answer, right? Let's be clear on that, right? And similar to what Aaron said, right? There is value in that early engagement, right? And I'll put some caveats on this in a second, because it can help you really achieve results that you don't even know are feasible, right? We've just worked with a client where the starting point was an RCT, and the RCT was nearly impossible to do, potentially unethical, right? And even though that was the initial agreement, right? That's how it's going to be done in a very rare condition, right? In a situation where there's no other treatment, right? At this point on the market. And a very carefully planned engagement led to the situation where now the primary comparison is a single arm trial and the real world data instead of the RCT, right? It was, for us, it was monumental achievement sort of as an organization, but it was even better for the company that is doing this very important work, right? But the second element here of my answer is there's practical steps that we all are calling for. Don't rush it, right? And in part, don't rush it because the minute you engage with the regulator, you're kind of making a promise. So there's a strategy behind it that you need to have. It's not just technical. You need to think about your strategic risk, right? And that's where you have to sort of have the time necessary for the thought exercise that it is. There's nuances that we all are talking about that may be forgotten after we are done here, right? Because they're technical, right? They matter in a moment when you're taking that decision, but you need time to consider them or else, as I said.
Yeah, so I completely echo that, Radek. A rushed regulatory discussion or addressing a question is doomed to fail. We could probably make a T-shirt out of that, but absolutely agree that needs to be methodically planned and, dare I say, designed, because it will have implications on the strategy going forward. I know we've got just a few minutes, and there are several great questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to everyone, but one that I would like to just quickly address from a personal experience in the space. One of the biggest barriers to accessing high quality real world data in the US, and how are they being addressed? We'll make this a quick question because there are a few others that I'd like to touch on very briefly. But one thing that I would like to mention is having clarity around the numerous real-world data aggregators versus the need for bespoke data. Having some idea of that up front is very important. And obviously, it gets into feasibility. There's many design considerations as to the data that's actually needed to support the use case. We won't have time to get into all of that today. But I would like to say, from a business perspective, one thing that I've seen come up several times is and maybe this ties back, we were talking about misconceptions earlier. I have seen several teams that developed a budget for the work, and it was predicated on licensing real world data, and they had been overly influenced by the cost of claims data. And there was this presumption that the budget that they had allocated for licensure of the data was essentially, EMR was no different than claims in terms of cost. And that can't be further from the truth. If you're engaging with a health system who has gone through the efforts to monetize, and I use that word with caution, but they've had to go through many considerations. They've had to lay out a framework of how they're going to make the data available. No health system that I know is looking for substantial profit from the supply of data. It's more cost coverage. But if they've gone through that, then it's an expectation that it's a business and that they're pricing it, in some cases, very, very appropriately. In most of my experiences, it's been priced below what they probably could obtain in the market. And so I think it's important to consider that if you're looking for an enriched data set where missingness has been addressed, that there's been an effort to provide that from a fulfillment perspective, it is going to be much more expensive than traditional claims data. And so, again, we won't have time to delve too far into this, but I just wanted to note from a business perspective, it's really important to have a pricing consideration for the real world data that you're trying to access. Any additional team quick comments on that? And otherwise, we could move on to another question. All right. So, Aaron, I'm going to direct this to you initially, this next question, and then we can have the panel respond. And I love it because it echoes so many things that we've already talked about. But how do you balance innovation in study design with the need for scientific rigor and credibility? And I would go so far as to say that much of the innovation that we see occurring is intended to increase the scientific rigor and credibility, or should be. So maybe, Aaron, if you could kick us off with just a few thoughts around that balance of innovation with study design, and then we can turn to the panel.
Yeah, Matt, no, and thank you for teeing that up. As I was skimming through the comments and looking at the questions, when I saw this one, I thought the same thing. I was a little curious, the author of the question, what innovations they're thinking of. My mind went to innovations that increase not only scientific rigor. A lot of times I will talk about both scientific rigor and medical informatics and data science rigor. Tightly integrated, but slightly different from each other, whether we're talking about the scientific needs and the research question we're asking and how innovations can help guide us in terms of study design around that aspect of things, innovations that are helping us write protocols based on and documentation based on those needs versus when I was talking about earlier, a lot around computable operational definitions and algorithms and code lists and so forth. To me, that kind of falls into the informatics and kind of data science rigor side of it, and looking at innovations that help guide us, even things like mapping between code systems and do the codes actually mean what I think they mean? Just because they have a title on it doesn't always mean that they mean what I think they mean. And so I'm a little curious about the balancing question part of this, because I also leaned towards the way you were thinking, Matt, is the innovations that are more kind of top of my mind are ones that are driving scientific rigor, informatics rigor versus alternative. Maybe the one that might come to mind is we all talk about AI and LLMs. Now that can mean a lot of different things. And so there, certainly, I think in general, depending on what AI tooling you're thinking about and what the purposes you're using it for, I think it's still today is requiring a lot of an expert's interpretation and use of those tooling to drive scientific rigorous study design. But even still, I think we can use those tools to drive higher rigor, studies. Not necessarily that I feel like it's always a balancing act per se.
So I'll just add to that the intent for most innovations is to try to improve things and make them better. And yet there's always some time period for broader understanding, demonstration of its application in different areas, for enough people to be trained both on the academic side, the industry side, the regulatory side. I mean, Bayesian analysis was new and innovative at one time, and it was more difficult computationally, and it took a while for software to make it feasible to be done. But now there's well-established areas where it's the best way to do things. So causal inference Radek has mentioned, and I'll just use the example that there's actually a forum called FIORD, a Forum for the Integration of Observational and Randomized Data, which seems very cutting edge. That is, FDA participates in that, and it's looking at all of the innovations in causal inference. A lot of these different frameworks. There's the target trial emulation framework. There's the potential outcomes framework, the Judea-Pearl, directed acyclic graphs, causal modeling, graphical modeling. And so there's, advances that are made. There's attempt to try to harmonize and understand the relationship of these together and when they're best for what purpose. And so that's like a moving target in terms of the advanced scientists in the world that are driving these capabilities and then making them practical. As Radek said, I think Miguel Hernandez is the most intuitive and practical of the tools. And so just leave it at that it all depends for the particular purpose again. So the application depends on the use case, which depends on the disease and the context. But that requires the expertise to advise you on that frontier.
Thank you, Charlie. I know that we're short on time, and just in the spirit of one of the traditions of Real World Wednesday is often future focus and future thoughts, and sort of the 15-second version of that from each of you, something that you're excited about or look forward to maybe over the next year to 5 years in the real world data, real world evidence arena. Stu, could I start with you?
Harmonization of definitions and regulations.
Love it. Charlie?
The incorporation of AI into real world data clinical trials in the appropriate place with the right safeguards and governance to ensure that it's safe.
Exciting, for sure. Aaron?
Yeah, I was going to go down the AI route, but specifically thinking about more novel and innovative ways to curate the data from sources and get us kind of a broader perspective on data around patient populations. There's still a lot of information about patients and healthcare that are locked up in notes and reports and so forth that, we've been doing natural language processing for decades, right, Charlie? But I think there's still an opportunity for the most advanced AIs today to kind of really help unlock that in a safe way.
And Radek?
I look towards the next steps on the European health data space. I'm just so excited about the possibility of it, having scars on my back on trying to do European real-world data work over the decades. I hope it works. I'm looking forward to it because it's going to be the biggest data set or one of the largest data sets out there, right? So let's hope.
Well, and I'm very excited about the rise in access and use of real world data in the MENA region and all of the litany of opportunities that are going to result from that. But I would like to thank the Healthark Insights team. The expertise that you have is certainly going to help lead and guide numerous clients. And we really appreciate being a part of the conference. And thank you so much for the opportunity to have our esteemed panel speaking on such an exciting topic.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Aaron, and all our panelists for addressing the questions patiently to our audience and sharing such valuable perspectives. And as we move to this era of AI, ensuring that real-world data is truly fit for purpose will be critical to driving credible insights and leading better health decisions. And as Radek mentioned, fit for purpose data is not just about the data itself. It's also about the perspective of who's interpreting it, and striking the right balance between data quality, context, and intent will be the key to unlocking this potential data is what we take away from this majorly. So I hope the audience enjoyed, and thank you panelists for being here. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.